In the last session, we looked at the final section of the journey from blindness to light. We began with the narrative of Jesus and the little children, which was followed by the story of the rich young man and the disciples' reaction to it. The third and final prediction of the Passion followed. This was contrasted to the story of the ambition of James and John, who represent the disciples who just don't get what Jesus is all about. We concluded the session with the narrative about the cure of the blind Bartimaeus, which brings the entire section to a close. We turn now to the Jerusalem ministry in Mark's Gospel. This comprises the 11th through 13th chapters of Mark. We shall look at the material from chapters 11 and part of 12 in this session. The material from the remainder of chapter 12 and chapter 13 we'll take up in the next session. The 11th chapter begins with the narrative of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. This is followed by two incidents that form yet another Markan sandwich: the expelling of the buyers and sellers from the temple and the cursing of the fig tree. After the chief priests and the scribes question Jesus' authority to do the things that he does, the 12th chapter begins with the parable of the wicked tenants. Then a series of questions follow, beginning with the question of paying taxes. The remaining questions of chapter 12 we will look at in the next session. We shall provide a more detailed look at the narratives in bold print. The entry narrative into Jerusalem begins the rather quick Jerusalem ministry of Jesus. It is set in 3 days. The first two pass extremely quickly in the first part of chapter 11, and the third comprises the rest of chapter 11 and the whole of chapters 12 and 13. The map points out the major sites of the later or southern ministry of Jesus. The last known site was Jericho, and so we can imagine that Jesus and his company travel along the road between Jericho and Jerusalem, ascending the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives to make their descent into the city of Jerusalem. The narrative begins as they were near Jerusalem, in particular in the regions of Bethphage and Bethany, two villages on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. The unit is divided into two distinct parts. First, the procuring of the animal, a colt for Jesus to ride into the city, and second, the actual entry procession. The first utilizes a technique known as command fulfillment. Mark tells us that Jesus sent two of his disciples on a mission and gives them instructions on what they are to do. This picture is the city of Jerusalem as seen from the top of the Mount of Olives today. The large structure in the middle is the retaining wall of the Temple Mount, on top of which currently sits the Dome of the Rock, which houses the Rock of Arauna, from which it was believed that Muhammad ascended into heaven in Islamic belief. That's the gold dome you see in the middle of the picture. The mosque sits on the site of the Temple of Jerusalem of Jesus' day. It is truly a breathtaking view as one reaches the top of the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, and the whole city of Jerusalem opens out before them. The mission of the two disciples is then given. They are to go into the village opposite, presumably Bethany, and when they enter, they will find a colt tied up upon which no one has ever sat. This is a direct allusion to the prophet Zechariah, particularly Zechariah 9:9. They are to untie it and bring it to Jesus. Underlying this is the king's prerogative to conscript. This is therefore going to be no ordinary entrance into the city. It will be the entrance of a messianic king. Then Jesus gives the instruction in case someone questions their actions. If anyone should ask you, "Why are you doing this?" they are to reply, "The Lord has need of it, and he will send it back immediately." Now, this reply would lead us to think that there has been some sort of prior agreement with the owner of the colt. This completes the command part of the structure. Then the fulfillment is narrated. The two disciples went. They found a colt which was tied up, and they loosed it or untied it. Notice the verbs are the same as in the command section: go, find, loose, and untie. Sure enough, there were some bystanders who questioned the actions of the disciples. "What are you doing untying that colt?" Completing the command fulfillment sequence, the disciples answer as Jesus had told them. As a result, the bystanders permitted the disciples to take the colt. The disciples complete their mission by bringing the colt to Jesus. The animal is then prepared. They throw their cloaks on the colt, which makes some sort of makeshift saddle for Jesus to ride. Once the preparation is complete, Jesus mounts the colt and sits on it. This is reminiscent of 1 Kings 1:38-40, where Solomon rides on David's mule to the spring of Gihon, where he is anointed as king, succeeding his father David. Given the Solomon allusion, we can say that Mark wants to present Jesus as a member of the Davidic line who will take up his rightful place as Messiah of the Lord. From what we have seen in Mark thus far, that will occur when Jesus enters the city, and even more so when he's crucified, giving his life in ransom for the many. That, recall, is the meaning of Jesus' messiahship. Further, many spread their garments on the road, while others spread reeds and rushes before Jesus, which they cut from the fields. These actions can be seen as reminiscent of the welcome that was given to Jehu when he became king in the northern kingdom, or the welcome given to Judas Maccabeus as he entered the temple after routing the Greek forces and restoring the temple area to religious service. In any case, the spreading of garments and branches before a person is a sign of the honor and respect with which that person is held. Hence, Jesus here is being honored almost as a liberator. This, however, will not last long, as the people's expectations of Jesus in this entry will not be met as the week progresses, and those same people will be calling for his destruction by the end of the week. It's interesting that on Palm Sunday, this is the gospel for the procession with palms, and almost immediately the same crowd is calling for Jesus' death in the Passion narrative as the gospel is read. The people cry out, "Hosanna," and "Blessed is the one coming in the name of the Lord." The former is Hebrew meaning "save now," from Psalm 118, 25-26. The latter continues the citation of Psalm 118. Both of these are used of the Messianic king. Interestingly, both the root of the verb Hosanna and the name Jesus are the same, the Hebrew verb shuach, which means to save. Then the blessing and the Hosanna are reversed, making it clearly messianic. The crowd shouts, "Blessed is the coming of the kingdom of our father David," concluding with "Hosanna in the highest." The first blessing was originally seen to relate to David's son Solomon, but as time went on, it was seen to relate to the Messiah, and thus became a blessing on the whole Davidic dynasty. The second statement most likely refers to heaven as the dwelling place of God who saves. The Hosanna acclamation can be a request that God send from heaven his saving power, now that his designated agent has arrived at the point where heaven and earth meet, the temple. The entry narrative concludes with Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem through, as many would suppose, the Golden Gate, which would have given him access directly to the Temple Mount and the temple. In the temple area, Jesus looks around, surveying the area. He doesn't do any more in the temple area because the hour is late. In the Markan and other synoptic accounts, this seems to be the first time that Jesus was in the temple during his ministry. The Johannine account, however, has Jesus in Jerusalem several times before the final week of his life. Many would hold that John's view is the more accurate, and so this is not the first time that Jesus was in Jerusalem. After a short stay, Jesus leaves the city and returns to the region around Bethany with his disciples. Jesus retiring to Bethany would further enhance the case for the Johannine narration. Bethany was the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, who were good friends with Jesus. It would make sense, then, that when in Jerusalem he would stay with them. Hence the departure to Bethany. Another interpretation of this seemingly awkward visit to the temple area is that no one really paid attention to Jesus when he arrived. Usually, dignitaries were greeted by a delegation from the priests, and there was none of that. Hence, all he could do was depart. This is a map of the city of Jerusalem in the first century. The south and eastern part of the city, dating from the time of King David, is known as the City of David. To the north of the City of David is the Temple Mount, the platform on which the Temple of Jerusalem stood. Connecting the Temple Mount and the City of David is the Millo, which is an area filled in specifically to connect the two. To the west of the City of David is the Upper City, which housed many of the prominent leaders in Jerusalem, both of the priestly caste and political leaders. Just by the U of the Upper City, you can see the rather spacious palace of Herod in Jerusalem. To the north of the Upper City and the west of the Temple Mount is the New City. This is the most recent expansion of the city, which was most likely used for residences. Finally, to the south, to the bottom of the map, is the Lower City, which has some residences, but mainly is the Tyropoeon Valley, which lies to the west of the City of David, forming a boundary, with the Kidron Valley forming the City of David's boundary to the east. Across the Kidron Valley is the Mount of Olives, where the Garden of Gethsemane and several other sites are located. Just over the top of the Mount of Olives on its eastern slope is Bethany. Not much is said about Jesus' sojourn in Bethany. Rather, the text continues with the events of the next day. His encounter with a fig tree which has no fruit, because it was not the season for figs. The second day of the Jerusalem ministry begins with Jesus and his party departing from Bethany. Mark notes that Jesus was hungry. Given the strong emphasis on hospitality, it would seem quite unusual for Jesus' host for the night to allow him to leave without some sort of breakfast. When we reach an incongruity such as this, it's very probable that two stories have been joined to each other in such a way that they interpret each other. Many times all the details are not smoothed out, and incongruities will thus exist. So Jesus from a distance sees a fig tree with leaves on it. He checks it out to see if he might find any fruit on it to satisfy his hunger. When he arrives at the tree, he finds nothing but leaves, which is what you would expect from a tree in leaf. The reason for this is then given. It was not the season for figs. So what Jesus finds is perfectly normal. However, Jesus' reaction to the tree is anything but normal. he curses the tree. May no one ever eat fruit from you into eternity. The disciples hear this, which sets up the second half of the story which follows, the temple incident. Now, on the surface, this narrative presents Jesus in quite an irrational state. But we must be aware of what Mark is doing in this text. It needs to be read along with the temple text. In the temple incident narrative, Jesus seems again to be acting irrationally. Departing from the fig tree, Jesus enters the temple precincts once again. Knowing the way Mark has constructed narratives before in the gospel, we can surmise that there is a connection between Jesus' action in the temple and Jesus' action that we have heard with the fig tree. The first thing that catches Jesus' attention as he enters the temple precincts is the massive din surrounding the buying and the selling of animals for the sacrifices. This, it would seem, would be a perfectly normal occurrence in the temple, as many people many times came long distances and could not be expected to bring an animal for sacrifice with them. These animals were available at the temple for purchase. However, Jesus was not pleased with this. He drives out the buyers and the sellers from the temple area. Further, he saw the tables of those who were changing currency for the payment of the temple tax. Again, this was a perfectly normal and acceptable practice. Around the time of Passover, the temple tax would be levied and brought to the temple. Now, the tax was levied from all Jews all over the world and would be brought in several currencies. The temple accepted only one currency, its own, and so it was necessary to convert the currencies that the tax came into the temple currency. Again, Jesus did not see it this way. He overturns the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. Yet another animal necessary for sacrifice. If the sellers and the money changers were doing wrong, this could be seen as a cleansing of the temple. But they're not. They're part of the institution of the temple itself. So what is Jesus doing here? This is a picture of the Temple of Jerusalem. As you can see, there are several courtyards before one gets to the actual temple building. The white marble building with the gold around the top. On the outer edges of the Temple Mount are larger areas that are surrounded by porticos. It would be in one of these larger areas that the buying, the selling, and the money changing would have taken place. And thus it would be in this larger area that Jesus acted in the temple. Mark then has a very unusual note. He, Jesus, would not allow anyone to carry a vessel through the temple. There are several opinions as to what this means, but nothing really explains it adequately. Jesus then gives his rationale for what has just happened through the citation of the Hebrew Scriptures. What he cites is a conflation or joining of a text from Isaiah and a text from Jeremiah. First, Isaiah 56:7. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. The key here is the prepositional phrase for all nations. The temple is no longer to be just for Judaism. The animals, the money, etc., all point to a temple for Jews. Jesus' action is a prophetic, symbolic action that all that is going to change. It is, in essence, a prediction of the ultimate destruction of this institution and the establishment of another. Truly, the season, or the kairos for the temple, has come to an end. The second part of Jesus' rationale gives the reason for this movement out to the Gentiles, alluding to Jeremiah 7:11 through the term den of robbers. In Jeremiah 7, which is known as the Temple Sermon of Jeremiah, Jeremiah rails against the Jews who use the temple as a shield and a cover to allow them to do all sorts of evil and iniquity. The temple, or the house of God, has become then, in Jeremiah's words, a den of thieves or a den of robbers, and as such it will be destroyed. Jeremiah was looking toward the destruction accomplished in 587 BCE. Jesus, in this symbolic action, is looking toward the destruction of the temple to be accomplished in AD 70. In both cases, the temple was not accomplishing what it was supposed to, and thus would meet with destruction. The authorities who presided over the temple, the chief priests and the scribes, heard what Jesus was saying, and it upset them to the point that they sought a way to destroy him. We have heard this language before in the plot of the Pharisees and the Herodians at 3:6. The reason was they feared him. Now, it wasn't so much that they feared him, but they were concerned more about his growing popularity and the people's amazement at his teaching. What would that do to their power and their control over the temple? The narrative ends with a simple note that at the end of the day, when evening came, Jesus and his disciples left the city, presumably to return to Bethany to spend the night. Now comes the second part of the Markan sandwich involving the fig tree. This marks the beginning of the third day of the Jerusalem ministry. The whole structure from chapter 11 through chapter 13 shows that the events in Jerusalem constitute the final week of Jesus' life, according to the synoptic tradition. Mark notes that Jesus and company were out and about early the next morning, the third day in Jerusalem. They're returning to Jerusalem via the same route that they had taken the day before. So they once again pass the fig tree. They notice that the fig tree is now withered to its roots. Peter, speaking for the apostles, states the obvious in his observation. The fig tree that you have cursed has withered. The fig tree is thus a symbol of the temple. Both are not bearing fruit, because it is not the season for figs or for the temple. The temple, the center of Jewish religion, has served its purpose and is headed to destruction. In the synoptic tradition, the purpose which the temple served will be taken up in the community that Jesus is founding. The sight of the withered fig tree is an opportunity for Jesus to speak to his disciples about faith. The Jewish authorities are appalled at Jesus' action in the temple, and they want to know on what authority he acts. Jesus responds to them with a question concerning John's baptism, which they cannot answer. Since they cannot answer his question, he feels it's fair not to answer their question. A parable follows, which further angers the authorities. The parable concerns the tenants in a vineyard. Vineyard is an Old Testament standard symbol for Israel. Here, the vineyard will be taken and given to others after the tenants kill the owner's son. The meaning is clear. The season of the vineyard in Jewish hands has come to the end. The season of it falling into Jesus' followers is here. This leads to an arrest attempt, but his popularity among the crowds prevents it. In the next units, various groups of Jewish leaders will come to Jesus with questions in an attempt to find further reason to eliminate him. The first is a question of taxes presented by the Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees and the Herodians send to him a group to pose a question. The taxes are being levied by Rome to support the Roman presence in Palestine. Thus, the Pharisees, who are generally against the Romans, would be against the taxes, viewing them as idolatry. And the Herodians, who are very much pro-Roman, would be in favor of the taxes. Their purpose is to catch him in speech, to trap him. Since both sides of the argument are represented in the questioners, whatever he answers will offend someone. So they come and ask. They begin with a very positive statement, almost to butter him up. Teacher. Note the address. In Hebrew, it would be rabbi. We know, they say, that you are true. Literally, the word means genuine, real. Continuing, they define that genuineness. What any particular person says to you is not really a concern to you. Why? Because you do not see the face of human beings, but rather genuinely teach the way of God. Jesus is not swayed by this or that opinion, but genuinely sets forth what he feels is the way of God. So now comes the question. Is it lawful to give taxes to Caesar or not? Phrased another way, should we give or should we not give? The question is taxes. And does he agree with the Herodians to give or the Pharisees to not give? It's clearly a trick, and Jesus knows it. He knew their hypocrisy, Mark adds. He knew that their intentions were false, and so he questions them, why do you test me? Some manuscripts want to drive the fact that they are being hypocritical here home by adding the direct address, you hypocrites, at the end of the question. But the majority of manuscripts do not have such a direct address. He commands them to present a common coin used to pay the taxes, the denarius. He commands to bring it forth so that he may see it. In doing this, he's besting the Pharisees and Herodians at their own game. Many Jewish holy men would not even look at a Roman coin. In saying, so that I can see it, Jesus puts his emphasis on what's on the coin. They give him the coin, and he asks a question about what's on it. Whose image and whose inscription are on the coin? Now, since it was a Roman coin, more than likely the inscription would refer to the reigning emperor, in this case Tiberius. A common inscription on coins in Tiberius' day was T. Caesar Divi Augustus. Translated, Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. They're quick to respond to him, Caesar. Now, someone would ask, given the fact that many observant holy Jews would not even look at a Roman coin because of its image and inscription to Caesar, what were these Jewish leaders doing carrying around such coins that they could readily produce them? Jesus' answer, in typical style, supports neither of the positions that his questioners expect that he has to support. He says, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and give to God the things that are God's. In other words, he tosses the conundrum right back into their laps. Now, it's interesting to note that this passage hinges in many ways on the prohibition of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, against graven images, mentioned of coins, images, inscriptions, etc. Jesus is telling the Pharisees and the Herodians that there is an obligation to give to Caesar what is required in terms of the coins with his image on it. But in a similar way, we must give to God what is required in terms of God's image. And what is God's image? Our fellow human being, according to Genesis 1. Thus, taxes are acceptable. But there's also an obligation to treat our fellow human being with dignity. The reaction of the Pharisees and the Herodians is the typical reaction of amazement. We stop now in the midst of these questions from various groups to pick them up in the next section. Jesus has entered the final week of his life. He has entered the city of Jerusalem amid great enthusiasm. He has performed a prophetic action in the temple to show that the temple is destined to the destruction. He has been questioned about his authority to do so, and he's given an astute answer to the sticky question of taxes. Next session, he will give us the greatest and first commandment, and he will set out in detail the fate of the city of Jerusalem. See you then.